Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of OECD Green Talk Live, which will feature on non-exhaust particulate emissions from road transport. Before I get into the substance of the session and introduce the speaker, I'd like to start with a couple of housekeeping rules. The entire session is going to last 1 hour, and our speakers would have 20 minutes to make a presentation of the key findings, after which we will open the floor for question and answers. For those of you who are online today, you can send questions at any time using the Q&A function in the Zoom, and we will try to address as many questions as possible in the second half of the session. So now coming to the topic today, we are pleased today to launch a new OECD report entitled Non-exhaust Particulate Emissions from Road Transport, an Ignored Environmental Policy Challenge. By non-exhaust emissions, we are referring to emissions of fine particulate matter from the wearing down of tires, brakes, and road surfaces. And traditionally, this is an area that has received hardly any attention from the policy community, where the focus has been primarily on emissions from the tailpipe of vehicles. Now, what we do know and what's being recognized widely is that particulate matter poses a significant public health burden. In 2016, it was responsible for almost 4.2 million premature deaths globally. And road traffic is an important source of local air pollution, and it has been computed to contribute almost 25% of the ambient particulate matter in urban areas. Now, with continued population growth, urbanization, and economic development, we do expect motorized mobility in cities to increase by as much as 94% between 2015 and 2050. Of course, there are big changes in the fleet of vehicles that we are using, and that will confer a number of environmental benefits, but the overall trend in terms of increased motorized transport and the fact that we are not currently addressing non-exhaust emissions is going to pose an even bigger challenge as we go into the future. A final point I'd like to make is the link to the COVID-19 pandemic. There is emerging evidence that indicates that local air pollution can exacerbate vulnerability to other respiratory infections, including from viruses like COVID-19. So there is one more reason, if we needed one, to address local air pollution, fine particulate matter emissions. And in this broader context, also the topic for today's discussion, which is non-exhaust particulate emissions, is of extreme importance. So now I'd like to go straight to introducing our presenters today, who are also the lead authors of this report. So we have Fulvio Amato from the Spanish Research Council, and my colleagues Catherine Farrow and Walid Waslati from the OECD Environment Directorate. And they would be making a tag team presentation. So the presentation would be opened by Catherine Farrow, followed by Fulvio, and Walid will be offering concluding remarks. So without further ado, let me now invite Catherine to start the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Shardul, for the introduction. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you for attending this OECD Green Talks Live. My name is Catherine Farrow, and this work, as Shardul mentioned, is carried out with my co-authors Fulvio Amato, Alexandros Dimitropoulos, and Walid Waslati. Go ahead, Fulvio, to the next slide. Thank you. So just a quick review. Shardul gave a brief introduction, but what are non-exhaust particulate matter emissions? This refers to particles that are small enough to be airborne, and these particles can come from the tailpipe emissions, of conventional vehicles that run on fossil fuels, but they can also come from other sources. Go ahead, Fulvio. Thanks. So first, they can come from brake wear, which refers to particles that come from the wearing down of brake pads and discs that occurs during the braking process. They can also come from tire wear, which is produced from the degradation of tires and their contact with the road. They can come from road wear, which is produced from the degradation of road surfaces themselves. And they can also come from resuspension of road dust that has settled on road surfaces. And this resuspension can be constituted by both particles produced by these direct wear processes, as well as particles that may have settled on the road from other surfaces, other sources, such as nearby agricultural or construction activities. And these particles can vary in size. Here we have a depiction of two particle sizes that are addressed in the report, PM 2.5 and PM 10, which are 2.5 and 10 millionths of a meter in diameter. And because they're so small, these particles can have implications for human health. They can be inhaled and enter into circulatory systems and other tissues. Despite these negative impacts, however, they've largely flown under the radar, so to speak, of public policies to date regarding air quality. And they represent an increasing share of total PM emissions, as we'll see later. Go ahead, Fulvio. So the objectives of this report are to describe the processes that create non-exhaust emissions, to identify the factors that determine their magnitude, review the current state of knowledge about the health implications of exposure to this particulate matter, compare the amount of particulate matter, non-exhaust particulate matter emitted by electric vehicles and conventional vehicles, and finally to identify and reflect on some preliminary measures that may mitigate non-exhaust particulate matter. Go ahead. So before going any further, we'll just go over the key messages of the report up front. The first finding is that the evidence reviewed in the report reflects the scientific consensus that non-exhaust particulate matter has negative health impacts, and therefore it represents a negative externality that is not being currently addressed by public policies. The second finding is that although they reduce NOx and particulate matter and other emissions from exhaust sources, electric vehicles will not lead to sizable reductions in non-exhaust particulate matter emissions. And they may even increase PM 2.5. And this is largely because electric vehicles tend to be heavier than conventional vehicles. And the final finding, the main policy implication of this analysis is that there's a need to develop and implement policies that target non-exhaust emissions, and that electric vehicles should not be exempt from these policies as they currently are with respect to some policies that target exhaust emissions. So some measures that could be implemented in the near term include more widespread implementation of urban vehicle access regulations and measures to promote vehicle lightweighting. In the longer term, this includes the establishment of standardized measurement procedures and emission standards. There's also a need to consider pricing mechanisms that would correctly price the use of vehicles, including the social costs entailed by these non-exhaust particulate matter emissions. Go ahead, Fulvio. So next will be a quick overview of part 1 of the report on the nature, drivers, and consequences of non-exhaust emissions. Besides their health impacts, we're interested in non-exhaust emissions because as emission standards have led to a decrease in particulate matter from exhaust emissions over the years, this is not the case for particulate matter from non-exhaust sources. So here we have a example based on EU data. So we see that particulate matter from non-exhaust sources is comprising an ever-increasing share of particulate matter from road transport. And from these data, we see that in 2014, the amount of PM10 that comes from non-exhaust sources surpassed that comes from PM10 that comes from exhaust sources. And we see that PM 2.5 looks set to do the same in the near future. Go ahead, Fulvio. So what factors influence the amount of particulate matter that's generated by non-exhaust sources? First, the features of the vehicle, such as its weight, the rotor temperature, tire size and composition, the use of studded tires all play a role. The characteristics of roads and any regulations regarding their use also play a role. The characteristics of a driver's driving style, such as its speed and the degree of acceleration and deceleration that takes place, also affect the amount of non-exhaust emissions generated, and local weather conditions, including things like temperature, wind speed, and precipitation, also play a role. Go ahead, Fulvio. And as we've already mentioned, air pollution is now recognized as a major cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. PM particulate matter has well-established and wide-ranging impacts on health. Specifically, associations between exposure to particulate matter, especially PM 2.5, have been established for a host of conditions that impact circulatory, respiratory, neurological, reproductive, and metabolic systems. And it's the oxidative stress that's understood to be the main biological mechanism that underlies many of these conditions. Go ahead, Fulvio. So with that, that wraps up part one, and Fulvio, the floor is yours for part two.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's move now to one of the main outcomes of this report, which compare the behavior of electric vehicles comparison with the internal combustion engine vehicles as regarded to the non-exhaust emissions. In this first slide, we can see the behavior of sport utility vehicles for the emissions of PM2.5 non-exhaust particles. We can see that the gasoline conventional internal combustion vehicles emit around 16 to 17 milligrams per kilometer, while the two types of electric vehicles here are reported, one with the small range, with the small autonomy, about 100 miles, and another one with 300 miles, with a larger battery pack, so heavier vehicle. And we can see that for the small autonomy electric vehicle, their total emission of PM2.5 from non-exhaust sources is reduced by about 12%, while in the case of the heavier battery electric vehicle, the emission of PM2.5 are larger than the conventional gasoline one. Another important outcome is that the composition of these particles coming from non-exhaust sources is changing, because the share of tire wear particles increase in electric vehicles, while the share of brake wear particles decreases, thanks to the regenerative braking system, which reduce significantly the amount of brake wear dust. But if we move also to the other vehicle classes, like passenger cars here at the left and the light commercial vehicles on the right, we see very similar results. First, we see that all the small range electric vehicle with 100 miles autonomy systematically reduce non-exhaust emission by around 11 to 13%, but the heavier ones, the one with higher range, systematically emit a larger amount of PM2.5 from non-exhaust emissions. Another confirmed result is that the composition changed through all the vehicle classes when we move from the conventional vehicle to the electric vehicle. And in general, that the heavier the vehicle, the higher the amount of PM2.5 from non-exhaust which is emitted, because there is a strong relationship observed in literature between non-exhaust particles and emission potential and the weight of the vehicle. Moving now to PM10, we observed that in this case, both the small range and the large range electric vehicles, so the light and the heavy ones, emit less than the conventional gasoline vehicle by around 18 to 20%, mostly for the light ones. The change in composition of the non-exhaust PM10 is also observed for PM10, so larger amount of tire dust rather than brake dust, while road wear and road dust resuspension, which are the gray and the blue bars, basically do not change in absolute terms. And also for PM10, we observed that the light commercial vehicles, which are the heaviest of the fleet, emit more because of their higher weight. So to review, we observed that compared to gasoline conventional vehicles, lighter weight electric vehicles lead to modest reduction, both in PM2.5 and PM10. As a maximum, there is a 19% reduction, while heavier weight electric vehicles emit marginally less PM10, but can produce more PM2.5 than conventional vehicles. So there is possibility that battery electric vehicles can increase PM2.5 in the near future due to non-exhaust sources. Another important outcomes are the projection that we have made for 2030 compared to 2017 on a global scale for the non-exhaust emission by the current fleet versus the fleet which is projected by 2030. There are two different scenarios. One with the 4% uptake of electric vehicles. So in 2030, there will be 4% of the circulating fleet electric, and another one which doubles this number. So it's quite aggressive scenario for which has been already simulated by the IEA, International Energy Agency. And we see two different results, two important results. One is that both scenarios leads to an increase of non-exhaust emission by 2030 by approximately 50% of the 2017 reference year. And even more importantly, that the doubling electric vehicle uptake has virtually no impact on the emission factor from the global fleet. We also confirmed these results based on a more detailed data set available at two cities, Milan and Santiago de Chile, where these outcomes is also confirmed, bringing to a really modest benefit in terms of PM10 emissions and PM2.5, both of them below 1% reduction. So now I leave the floor to Walid, who will present the policy recommendation of our report.
Thank you, Fulvio. Thank you, Catherine. So far, we have seen that particulate matter has well-established negative health impact, that particulate matter from non-exhaust sources is an important contributor to ambient PM levels in urban areas, and that there's not any reason to expect that these non-exhaust emissions will be declining in the future. Instead, they may even increase if not explicitly addressed. We should also note here that the non-exhaust emissions are essentially unregulated. This points to a strong need for policies to address them in more targeted way. And we believe here this OECD report come to open a new chapter in terms of air pollution regulation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So an optimal policy instrument. Previous slide for you, sorry. Thank you. So an optimal policy instrument would internalize the negative externality posed by non-exhaust emission, given that they are generated by vehicle travel. This would come in the form of road charge. Emission that is determinants of how much particulate matter emitted, and importantly, this charge would differ from a flat per kilometer charge because it would need to be differentiated with respect to the determinant of the marginal social cost of non-exhaust emission and how great is its impact on human health. The main driving factors behind these elements, there's two elements. So the characteristics of the vehicle and the area in which it operates. Obviously, there are significant challenges to accurately pricing non-exhaust emissions. There are also practical challenges to implementing a vehicle and the distance-based road charge. For example, regarding how to measure the vehicle kilometers traveled and how to charge the drivers. Next slide, please. If we pursue the idea of correctly pricing the external cost of non-exhaust emissions via a road charge, that's it. If we consider all of the determinants of how much damage this particular matter causes, we would follow it form in its sources to its damage. A road pricing instrument to internalize the social cost of non-exhaust emission will require a robust understanding of the drivers. First of emission factors. This include vehicles, driving and road characteristics, as well as congestion levels, insofar as they may impact the acceleration and deceleration. The impact that emitted particulate matter has on ambient PM levels, including weather conditions, road dust, road temperature, etc. Then the impact on the ambient particulate matter has on health, which is influenced by the type of the particulate matter and the individual characteristics that impact to negative health impact. And finally, the cost of this impact on a per kilometer basis, which depends on the number of people exposed and other assumption used to value this exposure. Next slide, please. Thank you. Based on the criteria for high priority policy, we highlight in the report a few measures that should be taken in the near term that are likely to reduce the non-exhaust emissions. These measures are relevant in the near term, either because they are important first step to developing and implementing other measures, such as sophisticated market-based instrument or eco-labeling, etc. First step should be taken, we think, at the international level, for instance, to initiate the development of emission standards to regulate the amount of non-exhaust PM produced by vehicles. Second, this will require international coordination in order to standardize measurements methodologies. And steps should be taken to promote vehicle lightweighting, such as lowering the maximum weight allowed for vehicles type approval, despite the fact that emissions standards should implicitly also encourage vehicle lightweighting, average, etc. On the national level, reductions in non-exhaust emission can be further incentivized by measures that promote vehicle lightweighting, such as vehicle fees and taxes that are more explicitly determined by weight, even within the vehicle classes. There's some precedent for measures like these, as in a number of Nordic countries where electric vehicles are non-exempt from registration taxes, and where vehicle weight taxes will be introduced in the coming years. The hazardous content of brake and particularly tires should be regulated. Priority should be also placed on effort to develop technology that reduce non-exhaust emissions, such as exploring how regenerative braking system can be used in conventional vehicles or onboard dust filters. On the national level, existing types of urban vehicles access regulation whether they be low emission zones or congestion pricing zones, already help to reduce vehicles kilometers driven in cities, and can therefore also be effective measures for tackling non-exhaust emissions. These schemes can, however, be improved upon to better targeted non-exhaust emissions, specifically in differentiating fees based on vehicle weight. Finally, local authority can also implement management measures to reduce emissions potential where this is determined by the cost-effective. Example, limits on vehicle weight and speed, traffic management, street cleaning, etc. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. This slide, just I want to thank all the co-author, Fulvio Amato, who is the lead author for this report, Catherine Farrow, Alexandros Dimitropoulos, and myself. Shardul, the floor is yours now.
Thanks very much, Kate, Fulvio, and Walid for this overview of this report. We have a large list of questions which are piling up in the chat, but let me start with the elephant in the room. I mean, over the past decade or so, electric vehicles have been promoted as zero-emission vehicles. Now, the presentation you've made shows that, at least with regard to non-exhaust particulate emissions, that is, going to be important, at least as important as internal combustion engine vehicles for EVs as well. So, what message do you have for the policy community? Should we be less enthusiastic about EVs based on your findings, or should our enthusiasm be somewhat nuanced? What is your takeaway there?
Yeah, let me say a few words, and I pass the floor to Kate and Fulvio. Sorry?
Sorry, go ahead. Do you want to speak, or is Fulvio speak? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just kick off some ideas on that. So that's the good question, actually, and the answer to this question should be considered in the balance between the positive effects of electric vehicles and also this side effect, which is not non-exhaust emissions. EVs help to reduce CO2 emissions. And that's one important point. However, there's other negative side for EVs, including non-exhaust emissions. And I think the work that we proposed, at least in the policy recommendation here, is to work first on the materials, the technology used at the source of non-exhaust emissions, but overall to think about the weight of the car, because we know that EVs are heavier, and this will be one major factor to exacerbate non-exhaust emissions. Fulvio?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Walid. We can be enthusiastic about electric vehicle. There's no reason to not be so, but we need to reappraise with a more exhaustive approach the benefits of the electric vehicles. Electric vehicles do have benefits, clear benefits for greenhouse gases emission, for nitrogen oxides emission, and for combustion particles. But they do not have benefit or really marginal for non-exhaust PM. And as non-exhaust PM is one of the air quality issue nowadays, policymakers have to be aware of that and reconsider all the policies that have been taken so far, and take in consideration also these side effects.
Thank you both. Kate, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Then what I'm seeing is a number of questions on measurement related issues. And that's, I think that makes a lot of sense, because unlike tailpipe emissions, I mean, these are rather diffuse sources, and a lot of it also depends upon driving conditions and so on. So there's a question about the fact that there are a large variety of tires. What kind of tires did you use for research? more general questions about how these non-exhaust emissions are measured, and how do you account for a large number of differences, not just in the vehicle fleet, but also in driving conditions, road conditions, and so on. Perhaps this is a question for Fulvio.
Yes, there are multiple methodologies used in the literature to assess the impact of non-exhaust emission. First, there are simulation studies which use laboratory instrumentation to simulate, for example, the wear of brakes with dynamometer. We call it brake dynamometer because they are specifically designed to simulate the wear between of the disc and the pad. There are also simulators who enable us to simulate the road wear of road surface and the resuspension due to the movement of the vehicles. But there are also studies which are based on in situ measurements in the real world, measuring ambient air PM, and the characterization, the chemical characterization of atmospheric particles allow us to retrieve, to calculate which are the factors that are contributing mostly to the concentration we observe in ambient air. This is the most common approach is called positive matrix factorization, which use aerosol composition as an input, and the output is the contribution of different sources. There are other approaches like emission inventories, dispersion models, which give other ways of analyzing the impact, even from different perspectives. But the amount of studies large enough to be confident on the results we have reviewed in the report.
Thanks very much, Fulvio. One of the messages that resonated, at least in my head, listening to your presentation, is this issue of providing incentives for lightweighting, because a big share of the non-exhaust emissions from EVs are linked to the vehicle weight. How would you address this, given that you also have to tackle consumer preferences? And what we've seen is oftentimes consumer preferences are moving in the direction of heavier and more powerful vehicles, and that's what we've seen in EVs also. Now you have this massive truck from Tesla, for example. I don't know how much it weighs, but the consumer preferences are driving towards heavier EVs. And how do you reconcile that with policy instruments? So, I don't know, Kate or Walid, you would like to take that on?
Kate, go ahead, please.
Sure, thanks, Shardul, for this question. So there are, measures that seek to internalize the cost of non-exhaust emissions by targeting vehicle weight would naturally serve to disincentivize the purchase of heavier vehicles. For example, purchase taxes or registration taxes that are in part based on a vehicle's weight. Distance and weight-based charges would also theoretically disincentivize the use of heavier vehicles. So those are a couple of examples that come to mind.
Can we also use information campaigns or behavioral nudges or some of the soft instruments?
There are those are also strategies to induce voluntary behavior change. In other words, through these soft measures. Eco labels, insofar as once non-exhaust emissions factors have been established, to the extent that that's something that's measurable and able to be indicated at the time of purchase, that could also lead consumers to purchase vehicles with lower non-exhaust emission factors, for example.
There are also quite a few questions which are not just talking about the amount of particles, but the composition. So there's a fundamental question, which is, is there a difference in the particulate emissions coming from non-exhaust sources compared to tailpipe emissions, especially in terms of public health impact? And then there's a more specific question with regard to, what proportion of non-exhaust emissions correspond to asbestos or other materials coming from brake pads? That's a very specific question. But the general question is, are there differences in the composition of the particulate and what impact might they have?
Yes, I think I can answer to that. There is a really high differences between exhaust and non-exhaust particles. Exhaust particles are mainly carbonaceous particles, both organic carbon and elemental carbon, depending on the type of fuel which is being used. While non-exhaust emissions are mostly made up of metals, heavy metals and metalloids, but also there is a fraction of carbon as well, because brake pads are made of carbon fibers and resins and so on. Also the rubber of the tires contributes a lot with the organic carbon, but the main signature is we use in environmental studies to detect and quantify the contribution of non-exhaust are metals, because are really the fingerprints that enable us to trace such emission and quantify them. And from this chemical differentiation, this chemical change is also responsible somehow of the different health effects that we can observe so far in literature between exhaust and non-exhaust particles. The non-exhaust particles seems to provoke adverse health effects mostly for oxidative stress. So it seems that the heavy metals are responsible for this oxidative stress, and this biological mechanism is somehow changing with respect to the past. While in the past most of the effects were due to organic particles, both volatile and non-volatile. In this case, we're talking about solid particles with high oxidative potential.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Fulvio. Then there's a question. You presented a number of comparisons between internal combustion engine vehicles and EVs. In terms of PM emissions and the composition. There's a specific question which is about ultrafine particulate emissions and how ICVs and EVs compare with regard to ultrafines.
Okay, the amount of literature studies available on ultrafine particles is much smaller. There is some evidence that also non-exhaust emissions produce ultrafine particles, because the wear is not only mechanical but also oxidative, in the sense that during the high temperature processes of the wear, there is also volatilization of organic compounds, and this volatilization produces gaseous compounds but also new particles which nucleates from the gaseous precursor. So there is evidence that they can affect also levels of ultrafine particles in the city, but the contribution seems to be marginal with respect to the current exhaust emissions. In any case, the stronger or the more aggressive is the driving style, the more important will be the ultrafine particle emissions from non-exhaust.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'm looking at another question, which is talking about the fact that a certain percentage of braking emissions will be emitted to the air as PM10. Why not determine this percentage and apply a tax to the braking pads directly, as price the externality in the price of the braking pads?
Well, if I may, just to understand the question. So the question is about if we quantify the PM10, then we can adequately fix a tax rate on that, or is that the question?
Right. I mean, if you can quantify, I mean, I'm also trying to interpret the question. If you can quantify the percentage of PM10, which is coming from, I believe, from the wearing of braking pads, and then quantify the damage resulting from that PM10 and put that somehow in the price of the braking pad.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be the most intuitive way to proceed. However, and the reality is more complex, because when we try to internalize in externality, we have to evaluate the social damage. And one characteristics of air pollution, and in particular non-exhaust emission, is where this emission happen, means who will be exposed to that. So if you are driving your car in the countryside and you are emitting a lot of non-exhaust emissions or exhaust emissions, you will not have the same social cost as if you drive your car within an urban center where people are dense and can be impacted on that. So for this reason, when it comes to the regulation of non-exhaust emissions, one idea that we make in this report, just we say, look, we have already in the transport sector many instruments ongoing which are related to exhaust emissions. And this can help. So according to the road charge, or according to the tax, the fees on the car use, but it can help. This can help also to reduce non-exhaust emissions. However, when it comes to non-exhaust emissions, we know that the weight of the car, including electric vehicles, would exacerbate actually non-exhaust emission. And this is why what we propose, just to look to this any policy instrument to not exempt even electric vehicles, which can be heavier from this point of view, taking on consideration the fact that sometimes you can have in some countries EVs exempted from some taxes, or giving them some facility to access to the cores, the urban cores, or something like this. So this is why the reflection go a little bit behind just a simple proportionality between the quantity of emitted particulate matter and the tax. There's also the question where this is emitted and how can be addressed.
Because the externality is spatially specific, basically. That's the main point that you're saying.
Exactly.
There's another question for you, Walid, because in your one of your final slides, you had identified a number of policies and also a number of parameters that should be considered in pricing schemes. And the question is, do you have an initial sense in terms of how they rank relative to each other in terms of the various factors which might influence the pricing, and which ones represent the greatest remaining uncertainty in terms of their potential influence on pricing?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So the way how we look to this problem first is to consider as the automobile market is more international market. So there's need for international coordination. And I saw just through the comments now, there is already some initiative at the international level on this aspect, which I was not aware, but it seems it's on good track, actually, just to harmonize this problem of non-exhaust emissions. Then you have also at the national level, because the national level have to point out what are the policy to put in place to address them. But I still thinking that the local level will play for the non-exhaust emissions a central role in the future, because here it comes the ranking of the different factors that the question talked about. And in each city, we have to look at where people drive, how many people is exposed to this kind of non-exhaust particulate matter, and also I would say the state of the roads, because this is also something that play an important role on that. So I would just say that 3 levels: international, national, and local. But in the local level, we can go to the details to ranking these factors.
Then there's it's not a question, but it's a comment which says that so it's questioning the finding basically, and it's saying that brake emissions will actually reduce substantially with the greater proliferation of EVs. So if any of you would like to restate, your conclusion and what it's based on, and linked to that is a question about two factors. One is the condition of the roads, and the other thing is driver behavior, which can also drive, which can also influence the emissions. So I don't know which one of you would like to take that.
I can answer to that. If I understood well the question, it means it says that the comment actually that the electric vehicles will reduce brake wear emission. That's true.
Yes,
it's true. The amount of reduction due to regenerative braking system has been most of the times hypothesized because there are not many experimental studies, just a few. And what we did is to use the median of these values as a reference, and it's about 75% reduction from the regenerative braking system. Still, such a reduction is not able to compensate the increase of other non-exhaust emission like tire wear, mostly tire wear, due to the higher weight. So that's why the final result is only a marginal reduction, or even a slight increase for PM2.5, because the increase due to the weight is more important than the decrease of brake wear emissions. And can you remind me the second question, please?
It was related to the contribution of the road surface and also driver behavior. How much do these two factors affect?
Okay, the state of the road surface is critical. That's true. There is one study in Switzerland who analyzed that, and they found that the presence of cracks in the asphalt really increase even by an order of magnitude the wear of the road, and also the resuspension, because the turbulence is higher. So this is another recommendation you will find in the report, that maintaining a good state of the pavement is also important. And the driving behavior, it's really another important factor, because it affects all the non-exhaust emission, brake wear, tire wear, road wear, and also resuspension, because, for example, there is a power relationship of a quadratic relationship between the resuspension and vehicle speed. So if we increase the speed by 10, we will get 20 more more milligrams. So we need to understand that also from the individual point of view. There is there's a big message to give from the policymakers or from the scientists to give to the society, that the driving style is also important, and there should be some sort of training or awareness campaign to make this factor decrease as well.
Thanks very much, Fulvio. There's another question, regarding the suite of policy responses that you all highlighted in your presentation. And the question is about soft mobility, that measures such as fostering slow modes, bicycles, pedestrian, and so on, they should also be mentioned as an important part of the solution. So let me pose that question to Kate. What do you think about it? And
thanks, Shardul. Yes, so we in our report break down policy responses by aim. One aim being to reduce the number of vehicle kilometers traveled, and one aspect of one category of policies that falls under that umbrella are policies that do encourage mode switch away from private vehicles and towards soft modes, such as walking and cycling. So that's absolutely one of the strategies that we discuss in the report.
Thanks very much, Kate. Another question. I think if we do all the questions, we could be here for a few more hours. So this question is whether the analysis was only done on light duty vehicles. It would be interesting to see the comparison between medium and heavy duty ICEs versus BEVs for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and if they're orders of magnitude different.
Sorry, my micro was off. Yes, indeed, there is evidence that the heavy-duty vehicles emit much more than light-duty vehicles. The thing that the reason why we did not include in the report heavy-duty is the scarcity of such studies, which do not allow to make really robust quantitative relationship. But just to give an idea, in case of a road dust resuspension, there is a factor of 9 between a heavy-duty vehicle and a light-duty vehicle, so almost an order of magnitude more emissions. And also for trucks, there is a power relationship between the weight of the load and the emission potential due to road wear. So a power of 4 actually. So really a huge impact of the load weight for heavy duty.
Thanks a lot. A very interesting question, which is drawing a link between your research and priorities for a circular economy. So the question is that one of the goals in the transport sector for a circular economy is the retreading and reuse of tires. So the question is, have you looked at are there any studies which look at how retreaded tires fare with regard to non-exhaust emissions compared to new tires?
Not that I'm aware of. There are studies who analyze the impact of mileage, the impact of pressure, but not the recycling of tires.
Yeah.
Well, this could be a very important area of research, I think, because retreading of tires, as the comment notes, is something that's mentioned quite frequently in the circular economy context. Then I'm trying to, yes, can you comment on the effectiveness of potential local mitigation strategies such as road cleaning or roadside vegetative barriers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Road cleaning. Can I, Walid? Can I answer to it?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
For road cleaning, it really depends on the climatology of the site. The effectiveness,
Exactly.
it has been demonstrated, for example, for temperate climates, for Mediterranean sites, can reach up to 10% of less resuspension. But in like in Scandinavian countries with the snowy climates or very humid climates, there's no evidence that street cleaning, water flushing have a significant impact. Moreover, there is the problem of freezing surface. So it's not the state of the art. The current knowledge does not suggest that street cleaning in cold climates can be a solution, but can be in hot and dry climates. Part of the solution, of course, just a small reduction, maximum 10%.
Walid, do you have anything to add?
No, and I want to add something about the local level. I think the answer of Fulvio about the cleaning, water flushing, that's the way how we should proceed. However, you know, the local authority have an important responsibility on terms of managing congestion, because congestion, crowded traffic could be one big factor that exacerbate non-exhaust emissions. So when we have in the street, on the roads, many cars, and this will go like stop and go, accelerate, decelerate, etc. That in very crowded area, that will increase the emission, non-exhaust emissions, but also will increase the exposure because you are in high dense areas. So local authority have to play with some restriction. We know in different cities now that they're experienced to implement low emission zones and making the restriction for cars. That would be the good way. But regarding the results of this report and what we are now inviting policymakers to think about non-exhaust emissions in the future, including electric vehicles, I think local authorities have to consider with another angle the story of traffic restriction zones, low emission zones within cities.
Now, the title of your report is that this is an unaddressed or unexplored area of policy concern. But my question to you, which might be the final question of this panel, is, are there any countries which are making progress in terms of addressing non-exhaust particulate emissions through economic instruments, regulations, or whatever, or is it the case that it is generally not on the radar screen across the board?
Yes, Kate, go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks. I'll just mention off the top of my head, I know that in some Nordic countries there are, purchase taxes, registration taxes, ownership taxes that are weight-based and or are going to be moving towards being weight-based in the future. So that's one example that comes to mind.
I have some examples here actually that we have in the report. In Denmark, for instance, where EV are not exempt from registration tax as of 2016, and vehicle weight taxes are being phased in by 2023. So this is already planned. In Finland, a vehicle tax component for driving power that is differentiated by weight applies for diesel vehicles. In Iceland, the twice-a-year vehicle tax is differentiated by weight for vehicles above 5 tons. It's already there. In Norway, in addition to the registration tax, there is an entirely separate weight-based tax on vehicles above 7.5. And I would add also there is already discussion ongoing in France about taxing heavy cars. For the time being, there's no law or policy implemented, but something on the debate.
Fulvio, do you have any additional examples or?
Just a general comment. I think the higher the problem of non-exhaust emission of one country, the higher their action has been done, in the sense that the Scandinavian countries are somehow the example of action in Europe, but just because they have the problem there is in winter and spring is much more dramatic due to the use of studded tires. In the case of brake emissions, and I probably do not see any specific country doing more than the rest to reduce brake emissions. More some regulation at the European or global level has been taken, but like the asbestos ban, but nothing really national specific for a country.
I'd let that be the final word from the panel. So thank you once again, Kate, Fulvio, and Walid for this excellent presentation. The chat, if you've not seen it, has been extremely active, and not only are there questions, but there are also comments from a number of people. So I'd like to thank the audience for their active engagement. We tried to cover as many questions as we could, but time was obviously limited. But we are going to save the chat and reflect on your comments and your questions after the event. And this event, a recording of this event would also be made available on the OECD Green Talks Live website. So with that, I'd like to close this session of Green Talks Live, and I'd like to thank the panel and the audience once again for their active participation. Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.